Most arguments are not won with logic, they are won with language. And a few small phrases can quietly steer people's minds before they even realize what happened. Most people believe agreement happens naturally. Someone explains their idea. The other person thinks about it, then decides whether to agree or disagree. But human psychology doesn't work like that. Agreement is rarely a decision. It is a direction. And certain phrases guide the mind toward that direction before the conscious brain even notices. Tonight, we're looking at 3 phrases that subtly push people toward agreement. Not through pressure, not through dominance, but through something far more powerful: psychological framing. But before we begin, comment "aware" if you're someone who prefers to understand how human behavior really works. Because once you see these patterns, you will start noticing them everywhere. Language is never neutral. Every sentence contains hidden assumptions, hidden expectations, hidden instructions for the listener's brain. When someone speaks, your mind doesn't just hear words. It tries to complete the structure of the sentence. It predicts what comes next. It fills in missing logic. And in doing that, your mind often accepts ideas without questioning them. This is why some people always seem persuasive, even when they aren't the smartest person in the room. They understand something others ignore. Human conversation is not just communication, it is psychological positioning. And certain phrases quietly position the listener toward agreement. Let's look at 3 of them. One of the simplest psychological nudges in conversation is something called a tag question. You've heard it thousands of times. This makes sense, doesn't it? We should start earlier, right? That solution seems better, don't you think? At first glance, it sounds polite, but psychologically, it does something subtle. It frames agreement as the expected response. The human brain prefers social harmony. When someone presents a statement followed by a small confirming question, your brain interprets it as shared understanding, not debate, not conflict, just confirmation. So the listener feels a small psychological pressure to say yes, even if they were unsure. Not because they were forced, but because the sentence structure already suggested the answer. It feels cooperative to agree and uncomfortable to interrupt the flow. Small phrase, quiet effect, but powerful. If you've ever noticed people agreeing to things almost automatically, comment, "I've seen this." Because once you recognize tag questions, you'll start hearing them everywhere. 2. The presupposition. This one is even more subtle and far more powerful. A presupposition is when a sentence quietly assumes something is already true, before the listener has time to question it. For example, instead of asking, "Do you want to join us?" someone might say, "When you join us later, you'll see why everyone likes it." Notice the difference. The question is gone. The decision has already been mentally placed in the future. Another example. Instead of saying, "Do you think this idea will work?" someone says, "How quickly do you think this idea will start working?" The brain now focuses on timing, not whether it works. The assumption slips past the guard. This happens constantly in conversation, in business, in negotiations, in everyday persuasion. The human brain rarely stops to question the hidden assumptions inside language. It simply continues the thought, which means the conversation moves forward on foundations that were never consciously agreed to. If you've ever noticed someone subtly guiding a conversation like this, comment language. Because once you see presuppositions, you start realizing how often people unknowingly accept ideas they never examined. 3. The social agreement frame. Humans are deeply influenced by social signals, even small ones. A phrase like, "Most people realize this pretty quickly," or "Everyone eventually notices this," does something interesting psychologically. It signals group consensus, and the human brain hates being the odd one out. Not consciously, but subconsciously. Our survival instincts evolved around belonging to the group. So when language implies others already agree, the brain experiences subtle tension if it disagrees. It feels safer, simpler, to align with the implied majority. This doesn't guarantee agreement, but it lowers resistance, because disagreement suddenly feels like social friction, and most people instinctively avoid friction. Not because they are weak, but because their brain is wired to maintain social stability, which is why simple phrases referencing others quietly shape individual decisions. Now here's the important part. Understanding these psychological patterns is not about controlling people. It's about awareness. Because once you see them, you also become harder to influence unconsciously. When someone uses a tag question, pause. Ask yourself, do I actually agree, or was I guided towards saying yes? When you hear a presupposition, mentally separate the assumption from the statement. Ask, was that actually proven, or was it inserted into the sentence? When someone references what everyone thinks, remember something important. Humans often follow perceived consensus, even when it doesn't exist. Strategic awareness means you remain calm, curious, observant. You don't react immediately. You examine the frame. Because the most powerful defense against subtle influence is simply noticing it. And once you notice it, its power fades. Most people believe persuasion happens through strong arguments. But in reality, the deepest influence often happens in the structure of language itself. Small phrases, hidden assumptions, quiet psychological nudges. Invisible to those who aren't paying attention, but impossible to ignore once you learn to see them. Because when you begin to understand human behavior at this level, you start realizing something unsettling. Many agreements were never really decisions. They were suggestions the mind quietly accepted. Most people move through conversations without ever noticing the psychological patterns shaping them. A few people choose something different. They observe, they analyze, they stay aware. If you prefer awareness over ignorance, subscribe to the channel. Because the moment you start seeing the hidden psychology behind human behavior, you can never go back to hearing language the same way again.